Today I am going to talk about the contradiction of grammar and vocabulary in the Quran. In an orderly and logical system of thought, it is expected that the inner teachings and claims of that system of thought are in harmony with each other. An inner contradiction is when it is said that two or more articles in a school of thought have a logical contradiction and cannot be true at the same time. An inner contradiction can be compared to an outer contradiction in the sense that the inconsistency of the teachings of a system of thought with external realities of that system of thought. For example, if there is a Bible which states that the earth is flat and flat, this claim has an external contradiction with the knowledge and realities seen in the world of nature. But if that book states in one part that man is free and free, and in the other part emphasizes that everything is determined by the absolute will of God, this becomes an internal contradiction. In other words, it is a contradiction that is in the heart of that worldview without having to refer to external realities. Today, I would like to address one of the internal contradictions of the Quran, an old and controversial issue of compulsion and authority. Imagine that you are reading a text that claims that man is guided by the Creator of the world. In one of the pages you read that humans are free to choose their own path. They can believe in religion or deny religion. A little later, however, you come across a sentence that says your will and desire are ultimately independent reasons relative to the will of God. In other words, what God has destined for you will come to pass. This is a contradiction for the rational mind that is more likely to cause an internal contradiction. After all, is man really free or not? How is it possible that a book that asks me to take responsibility for my moral and religious decisions at the same time says that these decisions are not in my hands, but in the hands of God? This is our main question today. In order to address this contradiction, we must first clearly look at what the Quran says. In the Quran, there are verses that apparently emphasize the will and freedom of man. For example, in Surah Al-Kahf, verse 29, God commands the prophet to present the truth to the people, and then says, "The truth is in the hands of your Lord. So whoever wants to believe, he will come, and whoever wants to disbelieve, he will go." This statement is clearly a sign of the will of man in his acceptance or rejection of faith. Similarly, in Surah An-Nisa, verse 3, it says, "We have shown him the right path. He may be grateful or ungrateful." In this verse, it is also emphasized that God has made the path of guidance manifest. But the choice of gratitude, i.e. faith, or ungratefulness, i.e. disbelief, is in the hands of man. Because these verses apparently emphasize the principle of freedom of choice and individualize the responsibility of writing. To put it simply, the message of these verses is that man himself chooses the path of guidance. But in contrast to this emphasis on choice, there are other verses in the Quran that emphasize the absolute will of God and consider choice to be a secondary matter or do not even know anymore. For example, at the end of Surah At-Takwir, verses 28 and 29, after the invitation to choose the right path, man is suddenly told, similarly, in Surah An-Nisa, verse 30 is repeated, that these verses emphasize the absolute will of God for the will of creation. The picture shown in these verses is that man's will and destiny is completely under the control of God's will. If God does not want, no one will even have the power to choose the right path or to believe. This is where a precise reader can be confused as to which is right. Is man free to choose faith or disbelief? Or has the choice of man been chosen for him? Does the Quran recognize man's will, or does man's will know nothing compared to God's will? Because it is difficult to accept that both of these reports are true. On the one hand, the first report says that man is free to choose faith or disbelief. The other hand, the second report says that man is not free, but can only choose what God has planned in advance. These two reports have a logical contradiction. If everything is based on God's will and unchangeable will, then what does it mean to choose the right path? And if it is really up to us, then how can it be said that each of our decisions is dependent on God's will? This is the internal contradiction that I pointed out at the beginning. Of course, This contradiction and ambiguity has been prevalent in the minds of Islamic thinkers for centuries. In the history of Islamic thought, the pyramids of creation or non-creation of the divine will and destiny have been confronted with the will of man. Sects and schools of thought have come to the forefront of Islam, each of which emphasized one of these 2 points. The Qadri sect, according to the Quran, knew that man's choices, especially his sins, were beyond the pen of God's will and power. And they said that everything takes shape according to God's will and will, except man's sins. In contrast to the Qadri sect, of course, according to the Quran, they knew all human actions were according to God's will and completely denied man's choice. This disagreement shows that the early Muslims were also aware of some kind of ambiguity in the Quran. Some of the Islamic thinkers, such as Mu'tazila, believed that if man does not have a choice in his actions and commits a sin, and God punishes him for that sin, then this matter is contrary to God's principle of justice and justice. Because God must punish his servant by means of an action that he has made with his own determination and will. Otherwise, God is not just. Therefore, the Mu'tazila sect said that since God is certainly just, it is necessary to be extremely free and free of choice for man, so that his actions are ultimately based on his own will and will. But they had to prove with very complex and complicated interpretations, and with all kinds of tricks and words, that the compulsory verses of the Quran are apparently compulsory, and that their essence is based on man's free will. Some of the Sunni scholars also tried to argue with the absolute power of God, that God's knowledge and will do not have anything to do with man's choice. They said that God knows from the beginning what everyone will do, but this knowledge of predestination does not mean man's free will. They said that man does something at his own will, that God knows from the beginning that man will do that action. They said that divine knowledge is not the compulsory reason for man's actions, but only the consciousness of his choice that man will do at his own will. With this absurd argument, they wanted to preserve both the absolute knowledge of God and man's free will. But does this conclusion really come from the absence of the internal contradiction of the Quran? From the point of view of an external critic, like an unbelieving thinker, this answer is negative. Critics argue that if God truly knows the future in its entirety, then nothing can happen except what he knows. And this means that the future has already been decided. In other words, the absolute knowledge of God's predestination is actually equivalent to the determination of all destinies, because according to religious beliefs, there is no error or change in God's predestination. If God knew from the very beginning that, for example, Mr. X will become an atheist at the age of 30, would Mr. X be able to act contrary to what God knew and not become an atheist at the age of 33? If he could, then the knowledge of God was wrong, and this is impossible in religious terms. And if he could not, and had no way to act according to the knowledge of God, then what choice is left for him? In this context, the absolute knowledge of God and the predestination of everything in the divine, with the assumption of freedom of choice, does not make sense. The Quran itself says in Surah Al-Hadid that everything that moves in the heavens and the earth is written in a book or in a preserved book. Therefore, the predestination of every human is also predestined. How can everything be written in advance and asked of God, but at the same time the human being is judged? This is a question that the Quran has not given a convincing answer to, and in the opinion of the critics, the attempts of the speakers to avoid confusion are more like verbal excuses to solve the real problem. God disbelievers, doubters, and ignorant people have repeatedly called this confusion as one of the weaknesses of the religion. They argue that believing in a God who, on the one hand, is absolute and absolute in everything in the world, and on the other hand, wants to take the moral responsibility of his actions, creates a kind of unsolvable confusion. I will continue with the views of some of the most famous thinkers of God disbelief about this issue. Sam Harris, an American philosopher and anthropologist, has written a book called Free Will. Sam Harris believes that free will is a delusion. The choices we make are based on past experiences and the state of our brains. Otherwise, there is no self-determination outside of these factors. In other words, we have no real control over what comes to our mind. Harris says that thoughts and desires reach our mind, not that we create them with our own will. So we cannot say that I asked for something freely, because thinking of something comes to my mind in an unconscious state. Neurological tests have shown that brain signals activate a few milliseconds before a person realizes his own decision. In other words, before a person realizes his decision, his brain has made his own decision. It is difficult to explain Sam Harris's free will philosophy in a few words. From Mr. Harris's point of view, the sense of choice is a delusion. We are merely observers of what happens in our brain without really controlling it. Therefore, Sam Harris criticizes Abraham's religion in terms of free will in a few ways. He says that religion, especially Abraham's religion on the one hand, says that man is responsible for his own actions and must be punished for them. But on the other hand, they attribute everything to God's will. He says that this contradiction shakes up the entire moral system of religion. If God already knows and has asked me to sin, it is not appropriate for him to punish me for my sin. Harris says that religion says that man is responsible for something that he himself has not freely chosen. Religion criticizes man for things such as beliefs, thoughts, and beliefs that God himself has created. For example, he says that you will go to hell because you did not believe even if you were born and it was not possible. And this kind of fundamental injustice is in the structure of Abraham's religion. Harris says that religion, with respect to this duty that man himself chooses, they attribute it to another moral game that man actually has no control over. He says that if there really was no free will and scientific evidence to prove it, then the entire system of religion that is based on God and hell is unfounded, because punishment must be based on the responsibility of choosing and free will. Otherwise, divine punishment is not fair. Richard Dawkins, a famous connoisseur and author of the book God's Window, has also touched upon these issues. He believes that many religious beliefs contradict scientific morality and that there is internal contradiction within the system of religious beliefs. In his writings, he argues that if God is absolute and is certain that humanity will be informed in the future, then man cannot have a free will. Dawkins points to this point in his critique of religious narratives of man's free will, that if God has designed man and has been aware of his destiny before, then man is ultimately nothing but a player in God's vision with a plan. In this case, the conception of man as a plan is meaningless and unfair to God. Dawkins concludes that one must either believe in God's absolute power or choose man's free will. It is impossible to combine these two in a single universe. Is not possible. This criticism is in fact the same internal ambiguity that I mentioned earlier. If God is definitely aware of the future cannot be changed by man, and therefore there will be no freedom of choice and real power. Dawkins and his colleagues know this as an unsolved paradox in the heart of traditional deities. In any case, the central argument, because of these criticisms, points to a common reality, the existence of such an unsolved paradox in the heart of the religious thought system about freedom of choice. It is believed that the claim that God is omnipotent and man is responsible for his own actions prevents the establishment of an unbiased intellectual system. Either God had to put aside some of his absolute power and pre-existing knowledge in order to open up space for the real free will of man, which in this case would not be the absolute, omnipotent, traditional God. Or if God is exactly that absolute, omnipotent, then there would be no space for the real free will of man. According to Western philosophers, this situation presents a kind of logical dilemma that a coherent logical system cannot have both sides. So today I tried to explain the internal contradiction of the teachings of the Quran about freedom of choice. We saw that the holy book of Muslims invites people to choose the consciousness of faith and to realize the responsibility of disbelief. On the other hand, this book states that man is nothing but a divine criminal, and without God's will, he cannot do good or evil. This paradox has been discussed by religious scholars for centuries, and various interpretations have been made. However, from the point of view of external critics, these attempts have not been able to solve the real problem, and there is still a kind of logical dilemma in the Holy Book. The believers argue that if the text of the Quran was really the word of an absolute omnipotent being who is the only creator of the whole world, it would not cause 2 or 3 internal contradictions. Because if something exists in the name of divine truth, it should not contradict itself. According to atheists, the existence of this kind of contradictions is mostly due to the fact that they are made up by the human mind and not by the mind of an absolute criminal. In the end, I invite you to think about this difficult question, whether it is possible to believe in the absolute predestination of God and to believe that man is free and responsible in his choices. And if we believe in the absolute predestination of God, is it fair that he creates beings who are aware of their actions and then punish them in hell? Isn't this unfair with divine justice and mercy? Believers may argue that this does not separate humans from divine secrets and our mind. But a non-believer exactly doubts this point and says, why should I accept something that according to human mind has an unfair existence just because it is a secret table? This is where everyone has to decide which side he prefers. Thank you.